So now the cab's on, it's sort of opened up a whole nother sort of chapter of jobs I can sort of start on. Anything from mocking up this radiator, measuring up fuel tanks, tail shafts, everything like that. I can finish off all the suspension stuff. I've only got 2 of the cab mounts tacked on, and then the rest is the cab is just sitting on some shims to make sure it stays nice and level. I just want to check a few things in the suspension, make sure that the tyre clearances work and the guards and stuff before I go through and put all 12 cab mounts on, and then find out that we want to move the cab 5mm back or up 5mm or something to sort of help with clearances somewhere. So there's a lot to sort of go through there, but tonight I'm actually working on the front panhard, which is a key part of finishing off the front suspension. So we're going to go through that, and then next episode, hopefully I'll have a little bit more done and we can go through mounting the cab, getting all the bump stops and stuff like that done. So I thought before we get stuck into putting the panhard in the front of the 60 and coming up with sort of mounts and stuff, I'd go through on my dad's old whiteboard how we work out where we want to mount the panhard and why. So there's a few sort of key things you look for when mounting a panhard, which really changes how the car will handle and how the steering will sort of operate. There's a few things you really can't get wrong, basically. So we'll go through that on the whiteboard. Hopefully being able to draw a few pictures on here sort of helps clarify it for any guys that want to do something similar at home, because I've definitely had a few cars come in here that have been built by people at home and obviously haven't really understood what they were doing, and it was pretty whacked. So hopefully putting it on here means that guys at home can understand what they're doing a bit better and hopefully come up with a better sort of solution on their own cars. So first off, I suppose, what is a panhard bar for the guys at home who don't know, and what does it do? There's the front of the chassis rails. There's a really nice grille for a 60 series. And there we go. So under here, we've got, you know, our tires, and there's our diff housing. And it's got a radius arm that goes all the way up to the back of the chassis, sort of backwards, but there's nothing stopping the diff sort of going left to right. So what a panhard bar does is it mounts anywhere on the chassis and anywhere on the panhard and runs a line across, and that stops, you know, if you go around a corner or you hit a rut or anything like that, it stops the diff being able to sort of move left to right under the car. So for all the examples I use here, I'll be talking about the front of a car. Obviously, the back of the car is not going to have steering and things like that to sort of contend with, so how you might install it might be different, but the fundamentals are still the same. It's just what's important in the front is probably not as important as what's in the back, because you don't have like the steering box and drag link and stuff relationship to work around. So there's sort of 3 things that a panhard does affect in a car. And the first one in the front, obviously, bump steer. So bump steer is, simply put, when you hit a bump, the car wants to steer through no input from the driver. So if it unloads, it might steer left, and when it compresses, it might steer right, or it could be the other way around, depending on how the suspension is set up. So that is something that is affected by the panhard itself. Another thing is it raises or lowers the roll center. So the guys that have done falling stuff at home or done any sort of suspension research would have read this somewhere. In something that doesn't have a panhard, like a falling setup, you still have a roll center, but it's calculated in a different way. When you have a panhard, that's what sort of sets your roll center. And what the roll center is the height. If we draw our car, and if we said that the center of gravity is this high, and so we just draw a line through it, say, at the front, the roll center, if our roll center height is here, it is the difference between here and here that has the ability to cause body roll. If you imagine your roll center was directly in line with the center of gravity, the center of gravity is the point at which the car will balance, so the car would have literally no body roll going around a corner. But what you would typically find in like one of our Land Cruiser scenarios, the panhard's usually right down here. So if the center of gravity is up here, especially when you put, you know, a roof rack up here and rooftop tent and spare tire on the back and awnings and all the stuff just keeps getting higher and higher. The distance between the center of gravity and the roll center is quite big, which is where a lot of the body roll comes into it. Now, obviously, we can fix that with a sway bar without affecting suspension, trying to stiffen up shocks or anything like that. Then the third one, which is also, this is something that everyone would would be able to relate to without realizing, is purely just like driver or suspension feel, I suppose you could write. So what I mean by that is if we have so there's our car, you know, there's two little people in it, and you've got a panhard that runs like on a 45 down to your diff, and there's your tyres. So because it locates the diff left to right, and it's a bar that pivots at two ends, it pivots in an arc, right? All the way around. If it could, it would go all the way in a circle, right? So every time the suspension hits a bump and goes up, the diff is going to go across because it's going to go up in this arc motion. And then when it goes down, when it falls out of the bump on the other side, it's going to go back across this way. So the wheels are not really going to be traveling across the road, moving left to right, but what's going to be moving is the cab. So every time you hit a bump, the diff is going to want to go up, which is going to push the cab across. So it's going to give the driver a sort of sense of unsteadiness to the vehicle as it hits the bump and the car shifts left to right. You're going to feel that in your gut, like not necessarily through the steering wheel or necessarily anything like that, but it's just something you'll feel, and it will probably make you feel like the car's not too sure-footed, or maybe that it's just a bit hard to drive because it's not so nice and planted feeling. So that's something that, you know, isn't necessarily like something that might be wrong, but it's something that causes cars that are, you know, got a 6-inch lift in them with bad sort of geometry because it's all just factory lifted up. That's sort of what causes that feel that you get when you're driving a car with that sort of change compared to a standard vehicle. So when we're putting the panhard in the front of a solid axle vehicle, the most important thing that we're looking for is to correct bump steer so we don't have any when we're driving the car. Now this is done pretty easily when you know the sort of key points that are important, and the three things that are sort of most important to look out for is the length, the angle, and how parallel it is to drag link. What we want to do is ideally we have our steering arm, you know, nice and flat, or as flat as possible. So then we get our panhard, and we obviously can't mount our panhard to the pitman arm and also the steering knuckle down here because they move. So what we do is we compromise and we come in a little bit here so we can mount it to our chassis rail just there. And then we put a little bracket up off the diff here as far out as we can before it interferes with all the steering and springs and stuff. So it might be, say, somewhere there. And then we run our panhard across this way. And we want that to be as parallel as it can be, bolt to bolt, as it is from this ball joint to this ball joint. And that way it's going to give them the best chance of working in the same arc. So that way we've addressed the angle. We've got them as flat as we can. Obviously that's usually predetermined by the steering. We've got them parallel to the drag link, which is really important because that way they move together rather than sort of fighting each other. And then the length, we just make it as long as we can so the arc is the least sort of aggressive, which will help your gut feeling in terms of like the car moving left to right as it cycles. And they're the sort of three things that you want to look for when putting a panhard in the front. But I hope that was not too much information and it was all covered. But now we'll go through putting it in the 60, and you'll see that I use these sort of three things to make it work good. And the proof is in the fact that these are the three things I sort of pay attention to when I build any solid axle conversion or any custom suspension for any customers. Getting that in, and the cars always drive mint.
So I drew this up to try and clarify it. Here you can see the panhard's on a steep angle different to the drag link and how much steering is put in when the suspension moves. And then here you can see by simply moving the panhard how much straighter the wheels stay through the whole cycle of the suspension compared to before when it was going nearly full lock to full lock in the same movement. So now we're getting into putting the panhard in the 60. I stole this panhard out of my Hilux because I'm not going to need it anymore in there, and I needed one obviously for mock-up.
So in theory, this is ride height, so we want our diff centered obviously at ride height. It's level with the chassis, and our steering arm is in, and you can see it's pretty flat. So now I've got our panhard on our factory diff mount there, and now it's time to put him up this end, sort of, you know, where it needs to be, and then we can look at going ahead and making a mount for this side. I've already got a bit of a bracket hanging out up here on the chassis ready to go, but looking at that, I'm thinking I might just quickly take it back out and crack that nut and wind it out a little bit. It's pretty wound in, because obviously on my little Hilux chassis, it needed to be a bit narrower, but I'm thinking on this one, we're going to get away with it being a bit longer, so I'll do that before I get everything sort of in place and fragile. Alright, so I just loosened that nut off on this guy and made it a bit longer. I'll see how she fits now. That works out well. Who needs the string, eh? All right, about there somewhere, I reckon. So you can see that the panhard is pretty level with that. It's not quite perfect, but it's pretty close. But it's at the moment it's just sitting. I've just got that bolt done up there, so it's as good as can be. And then I've got this sort of bracket on the inside, or the outside of the chassis here, ready to go for a panhard mount. So that'll be really easy to make him sort of work with that. All right, so step one to working out where your panhard goes and sort of getting it as good as it can be is get your diff centered and at ride height nicely, and get your steering arm in. And then I've got my laser, it's just magnetized to this metal post here, and I've got it locked out, so it's not not trying to like auto level all the time. Every now and then it'll flash to remind me that it's not on auto level, but this way we can set the angle of the laser we want and it'll stay like that. So then, because we've got our steering arm in there, you can see, if I get out of the way, we've got a laser bang in the middle of our ball joint, and then it runs all the way up to the middle of our ball joint over there. I don't know if you can see that. Now, some steering arms will not be straight, you know, they'll have a Z in them, or they might just be bowed from use or whatever. It doesn't matter if the arm, or the panhard for that matter, run along the laser. All we care about is the two pivot points at each end. That the laser is an imaginary straight line from there to there. You know, the steering arm could go like down, up, back up and around through the radiator and back down. It wouldn't matter because it's pivoting from there to there. So that's all we care about, that the laser touches them. Not that it's actually parallel with that rod, because some rod ends might be taller on each end or something. So now that we've got that sorted, we can go ahead and remove that. All right, so now we've got the steering arm out of the way. You can see that the laser now has projected its line through onto our panhard. And you can see it running just along the top of the panhard there and then to that bolt hole over there. Now what we're looking for here is the same as the steering arm. We want it to be the same on this side as it is this side. So obviously now I can't move the laser. If it was on my tripod, I would be able to wind it down or up and like keep the angle correct. But unfortunately, my tripod doesn't go low enough to actually get this to there. Of course, you know, the tripod's pretty tall. So I've just got it magnetized to that pole, but I don't really want to risk moving the angle, trying to knock it down on that magnet. So now we'll just take a measurement and we'll just go from the laser point to the center of that bolt, and we just want it the same at that end. So we'll get on to doing that. 14 mil to the center of that bolt. So it's 9 mil. So this guy's got to come down a little bit. Oh, that moved a lot. Probably a mistake there. So that's 16. What do we have on this side? 14. Yeah, 14. So that was a bit too much. Call that 5. 4 or 5 mil plus 8 makes it 12, 13. So that's pretty close. So now the other thing we want to do is make this guy as long as it can be without interfering with this pitman arm when it turns. So when the pitman arm comes across, you can see there, That's not going to foul, so that's sweet, especially when that goes back a little bit. So that'll be fine. So now what we need to do is sketch up this sort of profile here, pick up this hole here. All right, so now that we've got this in place and we're happy with this laser measurement down to this panhard bolt hole, and we're as long as we can be without it sort of interfering with the pitman arm, now what we can do is we can go ahead and take a measurement from here up to our chassis there, and roughly from this panel out to the bolt hole, just using a straight edge, and then we can go and plot that on the computer and draw like a little bracket that'll sort of hold him in place. And then that's the start of our panhard mount done. Side of the chassis. And then, so from the outside of our chassis across, 46 plus 8 makes it 54. And then the width of the chassis here to the other plate, 75 mil. All right, that's pretty much all the measurements we need, really. What I usually like to do is sort of make a cross member that is the panhard mount that goes back across to the chassis, reinforcing it to the other rail all in one go. So I'll do that and we'll get that sort of cut out and tacked on, and we'll have a panhard in here. I'll just show you how we went. So, got that cross member done up and all fully welded out of the car, and then I've just got it jammed up in between the chassis rail there, and it's just stuck because there's so much sort of friction between the two rails. And then we've got our panhard bolted up at the bottom there, running across to the factory mount on the diff. And I don't know if you can see there, but the alignment looks pretty good for a ride height sort of setup. And just sort of recapping on the three things that we sort of needed is the longest panhard we can get, as high as we can get it, and as parallel as we can get it with the drag link. So we've wound it out as far as we can, so you can see it's as wide, that mounting bolt is as wide as it can be without it sort of interfering with the pitman arm here, when this sort of goes left hand down. And then we've got it bang on nice and flat while at ride height, and it's also very parallel with the drag link. So that's going to give us the best chance of having, you know, minimum bump steer and great sort of steering control. In like a lifted Land Cruiser or a Patrol where the drag link is on a really steep angle, when you steer, you can see with my car, when I steer, all the force is going across. So it's all going into this Ackerman arm here and pushing the wheel to the left. But when you've got like a steering angle, a drag link on like a 45, say, just for example, half that force is going into sort of trying to lift your car up rather than push the diff across. So it makes your steering sort of not as effective. It puts more input into the suspension over all of it going into the steering. The more effort you put into pushing across, the more steering you get versus wasting it going down. And that's also why a lot of these knuckles fail on cruisers, because you're pushing down onto them studs rather than pushing across and trying to break all the friction on those two surfaces that have been clamped and those studs. You're pushing down and you're just simply stretching all the nuts and trying to push that arm off. Whereas when the steering arm's nice and flat like that, which it is on like a standard Land Cruiser, pushing across, those studs are pretty much up to it. Unless obviously, you know, they've been sitting in grease and they're loose or whatever over time. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. And that means tomorrow I can put the wheels on and start cycling this, find our bump stop point. I'll have to lose this crap, make up some little crappy bump stops to just sort of imitate that so I can then get some shocks in. And that'll sort of button up the front end, apart from obviously welding.